Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. I deeply believe there's a certain grace in the world on a morning such as this, when together we gather, when we gently warm this place by our presence, when the simple beauty of being human makes us mindful of one another. Now, through the week, we may be running around like mad, our minds harried, our pace frenetic, but then we find ourselves here, a gentle place that comforts and offers hope to one another. This morning, I want to share my dream for America, where economic justice is established in an atmosphere of democratic freedom. Now, my dream doesn't necessarily represent the institutional viewpoint of the First Unitarian Church, but hopefully it will inspire you at least to envision a different kind of existence from the tumult that we experience today, and also present an alternative to the cold disregard for people, especially those who have no voice in our society. Justice has long been a vision held to vigorously by all religions and expressions of moral philosophy. Is justice really beyond our grasp? Is it really impossible to build a just world? Well, this morning, let us dream together. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. May we open our service, turning our hymn books, please, to number 38. So stepping aside from our busy lives during the week, let us take a moment, if you will, a meditative moment, just to consider where we are today as a nation in terms of extending or not extending justice to all people. When you think about it, it really does rattle the conscience, does it not? Our laws and policies are geared to maintaining the status quo as though history can be just frozen in time. But our hearts tell us, our conscience informs us, our moral mandate requires that rather than history standing still in time, history has to move to that ultimate goal where unity in justice is achieved. Now, many religious leaders, including those from Scripture like Isaiah or Jesus, and those in more contemporary times like Gandhi, Dr. King, Nelson Mandela, they all engaged in what I like to refer to as political spirituality. Political spirituality. That is, spirituality motivated to embrace the plight of the most deprived and vulnerable in society by moving the political order away from its self-serving principles that protect the wealthy. There's a temptation, a real temptation, it's convenient, to believe that religion is above politics, that the sanctuary is too sacred a place for gritty political battles. But that point of view actually holds a political position in and of itself, namely keeping the status quo. It relegates religion to the role of an ambulance, picking out those whom society has tossed aside, dealing with their wounds. As we know, Jesus was concerned most with those society counted least and put last. This priority is political and extends back much further in time than either Judaism or Christianity. Mo Tai, a contemporary of Confucius, issued many injunctions for how we should live our lives according to moral principles. And his most famous injunction was expressing concern for the welfare of all people, which must be accomplished, can only be fully realized in a spirit of what he calls, in a spirit of impartial concern. No distinctions can be made between the self and others, between associates and strangers. As a doctrine, it's referred to as universal love. It precedes by a few thousand years the Unitarian call to stand on the side of love. That's nothing new, what we're presenting to the public. May Mo Tai's words serve as our prayer this morning. When all the people of the world love, then the strong will not overpower the weak. The many will not oppress the few. The wealthy will not mock the poor. The honored will not disdain the humble. The cunning will not deceive the simple. When all the people of the world love. Amen. I don't want you thinking that you're in the wrong church when you hear this reading. This is a Unitarian Universalist church, at least the last time I looked. But the reading, well, I hope you'll understand the nature and the tenor and what I hope to accomplish by choosing this reading, which, well, it's actually self-explanatory. I don't have to tell you what it's about. It's there. But it does touch on the Book of Mormon and the early origins of Mormonism, although I know you're not allowed to use that word anymore. But and I really, honestly, I do try to respect that, but it's just, we'd be here till 1 o'clock in the afternoon if I said the whole thing. You are cursed because of your riches. It was a bummer message that nobody wanted to hear. Samuel the Lamanite stood alone atop the great wall of the city of Zarahemla to warn the inhabitants of their impending destruction. Now, you've probably never heard of this Samuel, nor the capital city that was once the center of the Nephite nation. In the year 6 BC, as the story goes, somewhere on the American continent, the inhabitants of this mythic city had grown decadent. There were extreme class divisions. Politicians were corrupt. The government disregarded the sick and poor. Sound familiar? God had called Samuel to essentially occupy Zarahemla, to stand up and speak out against corporate greed and wealth accumulation. For his trouble, he was promptly thrown out the front gates. Undeterred, he bravely scaled the city's exterior wall, evading a barrage of arrows and stones to stand defiant. He offered Zarahemla a choice: repent or be destroyed by God. Oh, like any of us who've ever witnessed the ranting of a doomsday prophet, the Nephites couldn't be bothered. 400 years later, Samuel's prophecy would sorely come to pass. After decades of perpetual wars and extreme environmental upheavals, the inhabitants of Zarahemla were wiped completely off the continent and out of history. They had been warned. The rise and fall of the Nephite nation is a cautionary tale included in the Book of Mormon. The book purports to be the history of ancient American people, written by prophets who foresaw the present day and knew that calamity was coming. Joseph Smith reportedly translated the record by the gift and power of God. The prophetic message of the scripture is sharp. If Americans are obedient to God, we will be blessed with riches. If Americans set our hearts on riches and ignore the poor, we will be destroyed. As an outcast faith, early Mormons experimented with communal living and alternative marriages. The original brand of Mormonism was typified by their rugged frontier prophet and polygamist outsider, Brigham Young. In 1848, Brigham Young famously declared, and I quote, "There shall be no private ownership of the streams that come out of the canyons, nor the timber that grows on the hills. These belong to the people, all the people." For a short time in the Book of Mormon, the Nephites abandoned their love of riches and established Zion, a classless utopia that had all things in common among them. Therefore, there were not rich and poor, but they were all made free. The Nephite story provides the template for Joseph Smith and Brigham Young's social experiments with communalism. They would both try repeatedly to replicate the mythic Zion. Smith repeatedly told his followers, if you are not equal in earthly things, you cannot be equal in obtaining heavenly things. Young also championed wealth redistribution. Quote, we have plenty here. No person is going to starve or suffer if there is an equal distribution of the necessities of life. But like all utopias, the dream is easier than reality. I'd like to invite all of you to take a look at the inside of your order of service, known as the guts of the order of service, to be reminded of all the great activities that take place here, be they educational, be they social. It's going to be something of interest for you. We are positive. Just want to just note a couple of real important things. One is tomorrow night, Monica and I will be doing a UU orientation class, which really focuses almost exclusively on new or newish people who know very little about Unitarian Universalism. This is a chance to be oriented a little bit about the UU history, which is rather extensive, and very few people realize it's global. There is Unitarianism beyond Salt Lake City. There really is. Talk a little bit about the theology and a little bit how this church works. And it's a fun evening, great refreshments, great conversation. And so if you're interested in exploring a little bit more, please come tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, Elliott Hall, our social hall, right outside that door. Also, please note that Monica is doing a continuous educational class called the UU Elevator Speech Class. And you can check the dates and the time of when that's going to happen. It reminds me of the time that I was an elevator operator in New York back in 1968. That's when we had those old crank things that go up. And my elevator speech was, because I could never quite get it level with the floor, my elevator speech was, sorry. It was terrible. Women in heels jumped out of my elevator. It was, several. Those were the days. Also, that's when I decided to go into the ministry. It was a lot easier than running those elevators. And also, what's really crucially important, the Board of Trustees has really been busy putting together the right questions for a focus group, and we're going to have a couple of these focus groups. It's called Courageous Opportunities, and that means taking the responsibility to look ahead. Institutionally, this church, this congregation, what is it going to mean for us to be the liberal voice beacon in the Salt Lake Valley in actually just a couple of years to come? We're not talking about, 10 years from now, whatever. Just in years to come, just a short number of years, what do we hope to be? What do we hope to represent? How do we hope to make this community even richer than it is now? And so yesterday, the first of these focus groups started, and I think there were maybe 25 or 30 people there. Good heavens, I hope that on January 26th, literally, we have 100 people here, because right now, I can't think of anything more vital than for us to take this time and share ideas about what the future is going to look like for this church. And even if you don't have any great proposals you want to make, you're going to be able to hear others' views, and there are going to be questions that's really going to stimulate your thinking about the direction we need to go, want to go. So please mark your calendars, January 26th, 2 to 4 p.m. It'll be great to have you as a part of these focus groups. This time, the offering will gratefully be received, a chance to greet one another and bid each other a fine good morning. It was not that long ago, and I'm sure many of you remember quite clearly, when our president used an expletive. That's newsworthy, right? He issued an expletive to describe his disdain towards the nations, especially in Africa, from which immigrants were trying to reach our shores. And he also, at that time, expressed his singular wish that more immigrants would come here from Norway. Now, why anyone would want to leave Norway for the U.S., that's another matter entirely. But don't let the white skin and blue eyes fool you. Be careful what you pray for. Norwegians would pose a huge threat to this country. Norwegians, who consistently rank near the top of the world in happiness ratings and overall well-being, they have highly organized labor markets, universal welfare, and high levels of public ownership of capital. In other words, Norwegians would pose a lot of grave problems in our country. If they penetrated our porous boundaries, they would immediately create a national health care system, extend new parental leaves from work, provide free child care and free pre-K, and give each family a $300 per month allowance per child, tailor-made for Utah. it would be as though Zion were recreated, extending from coast to coast. And Brigham Young's vision of wealth redistribution realized at last. But such radical concepts of equality have long been embedded in a variety of religious texts, and perhaps, who knows, might be the very reason that religion came into being in the first place. Holy Scripture recounts in many ways God's demand for equality among all people, ending the cruel and negligent treatment of the poor by the rich. Anyone would be hard-pressed to cite chapter and verse where God recommends a free enterprise system with markets allocating scarce resources through prices and the profit motive hailed as a surefire ticket into heaven. Instead, Jesus, speaking on behalf of God, admonishes the people with the following: "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me." Now, that quote is familiar to most of us, but it's the very next line that comes as a bit of a surprise. "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Whew, hot stuff. And if that isn't clear enough, we are reminded that a rich man has the same chance of getting into heaven as does a camel going through the eye of a needle. God's political theory on dealing with the poor is anything but tepid. And who knows, maybe God was really a Norwegian when you come to kind of put it all together. The challenges in constructing a just society always run smack into the tension between subscribing to a collective worldview or emphasizing the needs of individuals. Will the cultural values nourish the well-being of the group, or will it uphold the rights of the self? Collectivism and individualism have always stood in tension with each other. Like Ayn Rand's self-interest expressed in Atlas Shrugged, quote, "Achievement of your happiness is the only moral purpose of your life." And you contrast that with the book of Acts, where the many takes precedence over the individual. All those who had believed were together and had all things in common, and they began selling their property and possessions and were sharing them with all who might have need. Now, Joseph Smith tried to make that concept of sharing worldly possessions with all who have need, try to make that turn it into a real practice. Just no idle dream. In 1831, just 5 days after calling the first bishop, he gave a revelation which declared every member should be equal according to his family, according to his circumstance, and his wants and needs. And so to accomplish this, Smith instituted the United Order, a system under which members were required to deliver their property to the bishop, who would then redistribute what were called stewardships according to the needs of all the members. Now, I like to think that Joseph Smith learned this kind of socialism when he was growing up as a Universalist in Vermont. Kind of sowed the seeds back then, but who knows? The goal, however, the goal of the United Order was equality through the redistribution of wealth and the total elimination of economic classes. Wow. Now, that's a just world. Now, how to build a just world has confounded many a prophet. Presenting their vision of a just world as truth was always branded as an irritant to be readily dismissed. Old Testament prophets were persecuted by the society that they wished to reform. And Plato's enlightened man, if you remember, this enlightened man returns to the cave and is ridiculed by those living in the dark. They prefer clinging to their worldly comforts, lived in the injustices of their time. And so, we're kind of left to wonder, well, can a just world really exist? Can a just world be formed at all? Sir Thomas More, in 1516, imagined a place where everything was perfect and justice and equality prevailed, but he called it Utopia, intimating that a perfect world was inherently beyond our grasp. But nevertheless, the world deserved a good scolding. So Thomas More rendered a radical condemnation on the nature of man, community and government, freedom and free will. Written 503 years ago, it would do us well to laugh at its relevance for today. Thomas More denounced the vanity of political leaders. Can you imagine that? Political leaders were vain and, well, it doesn't matter. He denounced the readiness of the elites to engage needlessly in violent wars, the reckless wastefulness of the idle rich, and the misuse of religion by people in power. Now, these disturbing qualities remain with us today as we continue to fail in creating justice. But historically, those who held to the vision of a more perfect and just world were divided among themselves as to how socialism best be implemented. There are those who believe that people of all classes can voluntarily adopt their plan for a just society. And called by the need to live equally among others, then we could together form these communities to model how equality can actually be lived out. Now, these idealists were labeled utopian socialists by Marx and Engels, who espoused what Engels called scientific socialism. Socialism in this case meant class struggle and political revolution, not merely having some people voluntarily adopt this distant goal of an ethically just society. But many still believed that if we could only come together as a small community and conform to these ideas of communal living, these ideas of socialism, we would eventually have a whole nation of like-minded people focused on equality. So in the 1840s, more than 80 utopian communities were launched. The first purely secular community was formed in 1841 by the Unitarian minister George Ripley. It was called Brook Farm, situated in West Roxbury, Massachusetts. There, members farmed the land together and held the fruits of their labors in common. It lasted only a few years, as money troubles and internal squabbling eventually eroded the community. And one of the founding members, Nathaniel Hawthorne, later documented his misery at Brook Farm in his book called Blithedale Romance. In May 1843, the Universalists, Charles Lane and Bronson Alcott, established Fruitlands, a self-sufficient farming community in the town of Harvard, Massachusetts. They were highly critical of the Unitarian efforts at Brook Farm and decided that the right tonic for success at Fruitlands was a far more rigorous lifestyle. The community was forbidden to eat meat, consume stimulants, use any form of animal labor, create artificial light, enjoy hot baths, drink anything but water, and then they added the mandate that even married couples be celibate. And that's when the members started to exit. That was nobody's idea of utopia. Now, Bronson's family all relocated to Fruitlands, including his daughter, Louisa May Alcott. And under the rubric equality of the sexes, Louisa, her sister, their mother, did the lion's share of labor at Fruitlands. And when winter set in, life at Fruitlands became increasingly harsh, and by then most of its original members had already fled for more congenial settings. Louisa wrote a scathing account of life in Fruitlands in her book called Transcendental Wild Oats. This community lasted less than 7 months. Forming a just society in our nation seems so futile. Was socialism a vision that was simply unattainable? And over the years, as we well know, that even the word socialism has been demonized and considered un-American, running contrary to individual pursuits of the American dream, a goal that could only be attained by and for oneself. But then, in preparing for the presidential run in 2016, it seemed that a new prophet emerged. The enormous success of Bernie Sanders stemmed from his unflinching embrace of socialism, not as an abstract utopian concept, nor a revolution in class warfare, but what he called democratic socialism, like one would find in Norway. Now, Bernie was not a prophet in the Old Testament sense. He was also not as outspoken, believe it or not, as Thomas More, nor as radical as Joseph Smith. But I refer to him as a prophet because he is a leader who dares to speak uncomfortable truths. Uncomfortable, at least, to the establishment oligarchs of our country, and all those who dream of belonging to the idle rich someday. Now, Bernie's uncomfortable truth insists that capitalism is broken. It no longer works, for inequality keeps getting bigger. Corporations have captured our government, and our healthcare system excludes millions of people who have a right, a very fundamental, absolute right to good health care, regardless of their economic status or pre-existing conditions, and the list of qualifications goes on. And so it's interesting, 2016 became kind of, for the most part, the first time millennials got acquainted with socialism. An old idea, perhaps, but a vision made vivid and attainable through grassroots organizing. You know, the very idea of socialism had been buried so long because it was always the third rail for any politician. But today, for the first time in American history, the majority, the clear majority of young adults aged 30 and under reject capitalism out of hand. They see socialism now as a means towards achieving a just society. They feel compelled to stop a government that places business profits ahead of human health. An uncomfortable truth. capitalism is broken, and a growing number of Americans acknowledge it. We cannot continue to live like this. The desire for change is palpable. And the midterm elections produced a powerful group of new, young leaders from very diverse backgrounds who share Bernie's vision of a democratic socialism. If socialism was never put back on the table, New York would never have elected Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I hear she's quite a dancer as well. If socialism was never put back on the table, Detroit would never have elected Rashida Tlaib, and she is not afraid to call it as she sees it. If socialism was not put back on the table, the governor of California would not be working right now on extending family leave time for new parents for 6 months. And if socialism was never put back on the table, the mayor of New York would not be working now on putting an extra $100 million into health care for the poor, including undocumented immigrants. Langston Hughes spoke uncomfortable truths in his poetry. I'm going to take a moment to just read an excerpt from the ending of his poem, Let America Be America Again. And torn from black Africa's strand, I came to build a homeland for the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today? The millions shot down when we strike? The millions who have nothing for our pay? For all the dreams we've dreamed and all the songs we've sung and all the hopes we've held and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet and yet must be. The land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, the Indians, Negroes, me who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on the people's lives. We must take back our land again, America. Now, throughout American history, the idea of socialism has been regarded as an unrealistic dream. Back in 1954, Irving Howe, editor of the socialist journal Dissent, said, "Socialism is the name of our desire." That's just an incredible way of capturing what socialism meant, or just the futility of it back in the 50s and times after that. Socialism is the name of our desire. Now, to a certain extent, that description still holds. It's no longer mired in the pathos with which it was said so long ago. Our desire, yes, our desire has forever been a just world, and socialism the means of attaining it. Sharing one's resources with those who have so little. It can't get any more simple. Sharing one's resources with those who have little or nothing constitutes the urgent cry of all religions, battling self-interest and greed. this desire for equality led to the formation of many communal experiments. It's led to revolutions. It's led, finally, to where we are now, poised to see if we can create a just world after all. The signs point globally to shrinking markets and further exploitation of the poor. So at some point, capitalism will not be able to be sustained. And our new leadership, primarily youthful, is set to institute an alternative vision of how we can go about our lives, how we can really live together. They regard America as the land that never has been yet and yet must be. Let us hope so. Amen. Can we close our service turning our hymn books, please, to number 318. As we extinguish the chalice, I want to conclude with these closing words by a poet, Zadi, from Persia, about 16th century. He said, "To worship God is nothing other than to serve the people. It does not need rosaries, prayer, carpets, or robes. All people are members of the same body, created from one essence. If fate brings suffering to one member, the others cannot stay